Good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Bailey. I am the Education Program Manager and Preservation Consultant at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. My pronouns are she, her. I'm really delighted to welcome you here to our 5th session in the dialogue series, centered around various issues of diversity and inclusion in the field of collections care. As with the previous sessions in this series, our facilitator is Sarah Ferrone, to whom I will momentarily turn over the program. But to begin our time together, I have, of course, a few pieces of housekeeping, so bear with me. Firstly, I would like to thank our primary funder for this educational and collaborative initiative, the National Endowment for the Humanities. A fresh hello to many new folks who are joining this session in the series as their first. To you, please allow me to offer a very brief overview of the structure of this series. In short, we are together contributing to some of the incredibly significant work being done in building a DEIA infrastructure within collections care that can be sustainable beyond this moment in time. And the goal is not to present a definitive guidebook on the topics, but rather to build this guidebook together as a community. And to this end, each session of the dialogue series focuses on a specific issue in the field. And each session is comprised of 2 components: a webinar with a speaker presenting their own observations in the field, and then the following day, a community dialogue led by facilitator Sarah Ferrone. Additionally, as each topic is discussed and processed, key takeaways are compiled to build a publicly available toolkit for individuals who are looking to apply or expand principles in work at their own organizations. Currently, by the way, the toolkit for session 1 to 3 is available online. And hopefully, there it is. There's the link to the toolkit in the chat box. And that toolkit is being expanded as we complete each session in this series. So some logistics for this Zoom webinar. Firstly, if you would like to follow along with captions, you might actually need to activate that setting within your own unique Zoom interface. So towards the bottom of the screen, you should see a button that reads CC Live Transcript. Go ahead and click that and then choose Show Subtitle. My colleague Alana Schaefer is here with us in the Zoom webinar, and if you're having any technical difficulties, you can send her a private message by selecting the name Alana Schaefer from the pull-down menu in the chat box. Today's event is set up as a Zoom webinar, which I'm sure you know means that participants can actually not speak, but they can type into the chat box. Now, don't worry, because tomorrow when we reconvene in Zoom, we are going to do so via a Zoom meeting. So tomorrow, we'll be able to have a lively discussion using both our video and audio in real time. While our discussion tomorrow will not be recorded for issues of privacy, vulnerability, and the conversational tone we hope to strike, this introductory content portion today is being recorded, as well as anything that's posted to the chat box. The transcript created through those closed captions and in the chat box, that we're going to keep those, and we use those as aids for creating the toolkit. So during the presentation today, please type your questions and your comments into the chat box. And this is your opportunity to engage with the speaker, as tomorrow, remember, is a dialogue session with Sarah and the participants only. Any posts that we don't get to today in the chat box, or those questions that come up inevitably at 2 a.m. in the morning, will be addressed tomorrow during the discussion time. And so now, may I introduce Sarah Ferrone. Sarah is the principal of Dialogic Consulting, where she brings over 20 years of facilitation and training experience to every project, helping make hard conversations productive and enabling teams to work together more effectively. Thank you for joining us again today, Sarah, and I will now pass the program to you.
Thanks, Stephanie. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. It is so wonderful to be with you for the 5th of our 6 sessions. A welcome to those of you who are new. And to those of you who have been here before, I'm going to say a quick few things that you have already heard. One of them is to express my appreciation to both Alana and Margalit, who both work with CCAHA. Know that they'll be taking notes during today's session for our toolkit chapters, and I want to recognize them as the primary authors of each session's toolkit moving forward. I also wanted to speak to my gratefulness this morning for other things, including an acknowledgement of the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home where I join you from today in northern New Jersey, the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands each of us sit, and the labor of people who were enslaved in constructing many of the institutions that we work for and with. And to get us started today, it is my pleasure to introduce our colleague and our speaker for today's session, Kara Vetter. Kara is the Director of Cultural Resources at the Museum of Us in San Diego, California, which is located on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay Nation. In collaboration with Indigenous stakeholders and museum leadership, Kara leads a team, many of whom I have had the opportunity to meet, of dedicated cultural resource management professionals who strive to create and implement culturally sensitive care policies and practices that center Indigenous sovereignty and traditional knowledge within a decolonizing initiatives context. Currently, Kara sits on the board of the Association of Registrar and Collections Specialists, is part of the Enriched Cultural Institutions Network, and is an active participant in the Indigenous Collections Care Working Group. Today, Kara will discuss what it means to decolonize language within the context of cultural resources management, i.e. collections care, including how staff at the Museum of Us have undertaken this complex challenge, prioritized their work within an ever-evolving framework of decolonizing initiatives, and learned valuable lessons along the way. It is my great pleasure to welcome you, Kara, and I'm happy to turn the stage over to you.
Oh, wonderful. I am so happy to be here. Thank you all for inviting me to speak and to share my knowledge and to just explore the world of decolonizing initiatives just a little bit more. And let me just share my screen momentarily so that you all can see what I'm going to be talking about today. And then just one brief caveat, I am at home and I have children, so they may come busting through the door. So if you see them, great. So as we said, we're here to talk about descriptive language in collections care. And I want to first make sure that I'm not getting used to the screen share that I have here. So first and foremost, I want to start with a land acknowledgement, very similar to what Sarah Ferron did for her introduction. And so this is the land acknowledgement that the museum has created in collaboration with our home community, the Kumeyaay Nation. So the Museum of Us recognizes that it sits on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation. The museum extends its respect and gratitude to the Kumeyaay peoples who have lived here for over a millennia. They continue to care for and maintain connection to this ancestral homeland. And so for us at the museum, this is a declaration of an official land acknowledgement is just one of many steps that we and other organizations are taking to build a more equitable, a more inclusive, more anti-colonial and racially just space that is reflective of and grounded in Indigenous cultural practices and protocols. I also want to share some of my positionality within decolonizing work, as I feel it's really important to talk about how my experience has shaped how I approach the work. So specifically, I am mixed Black, I am able-bodied, I am a cisgender woman, I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter and a wife, I'm a fellow museum enthusiast, and I am deeply a registrar at heart. Anyone who knows me knows I am a super nerd about registration in museums. So that's a little bit about me there. I am a descendant of European colonizers, though, and I'm a descendant of the African diaspora. And so, due to the impacts of colonialism and imperialism and white supremacy, I know a little bit about my ancestors on the Euro-American side that go all the way back to the 1600s, but I have no idea where the homeland is for my African ancestors. Though I do know a little bit about what has happened with them post-Civil War. My family lived in Coahoma County, Mississippi, prior to being part of the Great Northern Migration in the 1930s. So it's this intersection, these states of being, those I both accept willingly and those that are imposed upon me, that directly informs how I seek to engage with the process of decolonizing museums. And it serves as that touch point to address the personal and historic trauma that sometimes comes up in the day-to-day work of decolonial activity and practice. So, what are we talking about today? Obviously, we're here to talk about language, descriptive language in particular, but I thought it would be nice to first kind of do an intro into decolonial practice at the museum, and then do a deeper dive into the topic of language specifically, and then talk a little bit about the future of language as we move forward into a more decolonial space. So, what you're looking at is an image, is an aerial shot of our institution. It's a beautiful building. It's a beautiful place. We are a cultural anthropology museum that was founded in 1915 for the Panama, California Exposition. It was part of several attractions in the purpose-built Balboa Park. And this park is beautiful. It has wonderful architecture, lovely gardens, but we also have to recognize that this is a site of harm to our home community, the Kumeyaay Nation, as some of their community members were forcibly removed from the area at that time in order to make way for the park. And then, to add insult to injury, they were not seen as being quote unquote Indian enough. So Southwestern Indigenous community members were brought in and placed as an attraction in the park in a specially built Indian village. Now, this was not uncommon for the era. Expositions and world fairs regularly had human displays. So this was very in keeping with the time, but we now understand that to be an incredibly harmful practice. And also, I will state that for this exposition, our institution collected hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of Indigenous community cultural heritage from all over the Americas, all over the world. And we even had an entire hall dedicated to the races of man that was under the purview of one Ales Hrdliska. Some of you may know of his name. He was a noted physical anthropologist for his time, but we now know that his views were heavily steeped in racist and white supremacist ideals that supported the separation of humans into racial groupings, with those of European ancestry being deemed more superior or of higher quality than those of Indigenous and Black ancestry in particular. So with that foundation, we continued to collect with rather encyclopedic abandon, like many institutions of the area. And we collected from a variety of Indigenous communities primarily for the next 100 years. So this slide shows kind of a footprint of the cultural resources as they stand right now within our institution. We have representation from over 150 Indigenous communities within the US. We have over 200 communities represented internationally, and there are some non-Indigenous communities represented, but primarily it's Indigenous communities. We have more than 75,000 ethnographic cultural resources, also known as above ground, and I'll speak to that change in terminology in a little bit. And then we also have more than 700 archaeological sites or below ground cultural resources, totaling approximately 300,000 items. And these sites are particularly from our region of the continent, in Mexico, Southern California, Southwestern United States. We also have a very large photographic archive of over 100,000 images and 300 linear feet of archives that are both institutional archives and above ground ethnographic cultural resources. And then we also, last but not least, have representation of about 7,500 ancestral human remains. The majority of these remains are of international origin, particularly from Peru. These were excavated and removed from Peruvian indigenous cemeteries by Alice Herlishka with the permission of the Peruvian government, but we know that the Peruvian government did not get permission from the indigenous communities. So that is an area where we need to have conversations with these community members and these communities to understand how we go about either repatriating or having consented stewardship. So that's a further conversation. And then we also have a small number of ancestral remains represented within the United States borders, colonial borders, and we are actively working to make sure we're in compliance with national NAGPRA. Oh, it went all the way to the end. My apologies, everyone. Let me kind of gum on back. Thanks for that. Okay, so given that the majority of our holdings come from Indigenous communities, we have a lot of work to do to ensure that we're complying with our guiding principles of decolonizing initiatives. And I have to say that decolonial work is not something that we just flipped into overnight, became experts at, and we're now telling everyone how to do. That is not it at all. It has been a really long and deliberate process that started really back in 2015 with us taking on an exhibit that's called Race, Are We So Different? And this exhibit is really about examining the concept of race, how it is a social construct, not a biological construct, and the varying ways in which race has impacted different communities and how we have gotten from the initial concepts of race to where we are now. And so hosting this exhibit, taking it on as a permanent exhibit kind of made us realize that we had to reassess our work with communities, Indigenous communities in particular, given the makeup of our holdings, and that this reassessment really had to start with our actions under federal NAGPRA law, because it was us recognizing that while we've been compliant, we've not been embodying the spirit of NAGPRA in our cultural affiliations and determinations. And so we really took a step back, realized that we've been deficient and that we needed to begin to actively listen to and work with our home community, the Kumeyaay Nation, because they've been demanding the repatriation of their ancestors and belongings for decades from us, as well as other institutions. And it was through this process of ceding authority and really having an honest and open collaborative consultation with these communities that we saw how transformative the work can be for all involved. We have a much better working relationship with the community now. It's still fragile because this is still new, but there is a measure of trust that has been gained in the work that we have been doing with them, and we hope to build upon that. Taking it further, we realized that we needed to do a complete critical examination of our institution as a whole. And that really started with the cultural resources that we hold, as this is kind of the core of where our institutional rot resides. We were collecting for over 100 years through this idea of racism and colonialism, and that we needed to really think about it differently. And so this review and the early work that review took place resulted in the creation of a framework of guiding principles, getting to the slide that I have here. And these are principles that are grounded in the seminal work of Decolonizing Museums, which is written by Ho-Chunk scholar Amy Lone Tree. And these principles are around truth-telling and accountability, ownership, changing systems and policies, inclusion and representation, and reciprocity. The truth-telling and accountability is where we actively practice truth-telling and the accountability about our colonial legacy and the ways that they replicate colonial practice and thought. It also means that we have to work to recognize how our current practice, our current policies might be perpetrating colonial harm. And so this is how we're making sure that we aren't just checking a box and saying colonial, decolonial work done. No, we are actively making sure we're examining what we're doing as we're doing it and going back to it. It's also about ownership. So it's about honoring Indigenous ownership to their material culture and their intellectual property. And it's about repatriation, both the tangible and the intangible, and making sure that we're not erecting barriers for communities to meet before repatriation can take place. In changing systems and policies, a lot of talk about language, which I'll get to in a little bit. And it's a principle where we've had a lot of change, and after much introspective and conversations with Indigenous communities, especially those most impacted by our historic practice, we've begun to make some really broad sweeping changes, both of smaller and larger impact, which I'll get to. These changing systems and policies is also about making sure we are prioritizing and centering and honoring Indigenous voice, knowledge, and requests as they come in, as things evolved. And closely tied to the changing systems and policies is the inclusion and representation of Indigenous communities. And I also want to state, I'm talking about Indigenous communities, but I mean all underrepresented communities, be they Black, Indigenous, Asian, what have you. We just primarily work with Indigenous communities because of the makeup of our holdings right now. So inclusion and representation is really tied into the previous policy, because it recognizes and honors Indigenous authority, and it's about Indigenous representation at all levels of the decision-making process. So it's about ensuring that we not only have Indigenous community members with a voice on staff, but also making sure that we are working to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and needs at the board level, having board representation and moving forward. And this is an area where we have a lot of growth that we need to do. We haven't quite found the right balance, but it's something that we're actively working towards. And then it's also about reciprocity. And it's an acknowledgement that the museum does not own Indigenous knowledge, even if research was done on cultural resources that are owned, quote unquote, by the museum. We don't own that knowledge because that knowledge was not given with consent. And so it's about making sure that we are acknowledging that, and that when we are sharing information, we are sharing that information in the same spirit with which it was shared with us, as in only with Indigenous consent. So that's an overarching conversation point about our guiding principles at the museum. What we have here represents a visual model of the systemic change that we're trying to engender at the museum. It's sort of a different way of to not only think about our guiding principles in action, but how they flow both into and out of the various areas of the institution's operations. So we seek to internalize positive systemic change through these decolonizing initiatives that you see on the outside circle, while simultaneously looking to understand and change the internal and the external facing aspects of the museum, be they the different departments that we have, such as our exhibits and finance department, the governance of our board, and even our museum membership structure. So next, how this systemic change breaks out is into a more bullet pointed fashion, includes a mix of policy and practice. And this isn't everything. I didn't want to completely overload y'all with all of the different practices and changes that we've made over the years, but these are really the highlights. And really, these are developed in such a way as to retain their longevity within the institution. We want to make sure that no one policy, no one practice is centered with an individual staff member, and that if that member leaves, that project or that initiative doesn't die with them. So we are working actively to build into our practice more of a longer runway for how this practice works. And there's a variety of different touch points at which policy and practice have met, but the P&Ps that are bolded in this slide represent changes that largely impact the Cultural Resources Department. So we have our policy on the curation of human remains, and we have our colonial pathways policies, as well as community and research access policies. And specifically, the colonial pathways policies outlines the various ways in which cultural resources and ancestors have come to the museum's legal control, as well as details how these belongings and individuals can be repatriated to their descendant communities, both above and beyond the current requirements of US state and federal law. And then in practice, we have trainings, culturally sensitive stewardship, and repatriation procedures that we're building and building and building. And culturally sensitive stewardship is where we prioritize the community's traditional care guidelines. For example, we really strive to ensure that communities of cultural resources are stored together whenever possible, so that If there is an item that has a sensitivity about it, we are making sure we're labeling that sensitivity whenever possible. We're following the protocols whenever possible, and that item is stored with their community of cultural resources, as connection to the community is a core facet of embodying sensitive cultural care practice. So I've kind of given you a big overview of all of the different changes and things that have been going on at the museum. And now I kind of want to transition into what we're really here to talk about, language. So I wanted to start off with a quote from Buffy Sainte-Marie, a Cree singer and songwriter. She said that language and culture cannot be separated, that language is vital to understanding our unique cultural perspectives, and that language is a tool that is used to explore and experience our cultures and perspectives that are embedded in our cultures. It's a really powerful statement because language is everything. It has a power, and language sets the foundation for how a relationship with Indigenous communities can be built. It can help the healing process by the establishment of trust between community and institutional partners. It can be mutually beneficial where aspects of respectful dialogue and decolonial practice are concerned. Both parties can gain something from having clear language about what they're talking about and how they move forward. But I also have to state that language can be harmful. We know this. It has been used as a tool of the colonial powers to silence, erase, and denigrate BIPOC communities from the very beginning. And so recognizing this and how museums are birthed from the colonial endeavor, we must continue to recognize that museums have a really unique position within the current cultural zeitgeist and the broader dominant historical narrative, and that this position is one of really great power and authority. So it is our obligation to use this power to redress colonial harm by ensuring that BIPOC voice is reflected in our work with language specifically. So in tackling language, it can seem like an insurmountable task, and it's hard to know where to start, where to end, how to do, but I assure you it can be done as long as we acknowledge that language is, as Buffy Sainte-Marie said, it is inseparable from culture. So for the primarily Euro-American community of museum professionals, it's about normalizing how language is used in the field to truly reflect the culture of the communities that the language is intended to represent. Normalization is key. So now to kind of nitty gritty, the dirty of it, if you will. When I think of descriptive language, I think, because I'm kind of a registrar brain, I think of collections management systems, CMSs. I think of digital asset management systems. I think of the workflows that are put in place to ensure quality documentation of cultural resources. So as we're cataloging, museum professionals are traditionally most focused on ensuring that there are appropriate object names, appropriate descriptions for items, search keywords like culture, maker, location, and detailed provenance. And much of this requires standardized language, such as nomenclature systems, but these are based in Western scientific terminology, and they are often not the best at discussing or labeling cultural items from an Indigenous perspective. So a first step in decolonizing language is to recognize that every community is different and every community has varying preferred language. So it's vital to ask communities for their preferred language and terminology preferences and how and where they would like an institution to incorporate them. And it depends, and their needs may change over time. So it's something that when you're having consultations, you are, touching base with them about this. I wanted to share a few examples across the next series of slides about how we have incorporated community-directed information into our database in particular. So this first slide you're seeing is a little snapshot of our database that is focused on controlled object name and other object name. Many databases have this option available, but some don't. So depending on what you have, you may have to find workarounds. But for us, we have two separate fields. One is a predictive text field for the controlled object name that lists the item primarily as a basket. And then this other item or other object name is where we put the traditional knowledge information about names specifically. We have other places for other information, but this basket originally didn't have this name of Oxmaur. I'm probably saying that incorrectly. I do not speak Kumeyaay very well. This was identified through consultation via a separate grant that we had a couple of years ago from community members who were noted basket weavers and knowledge holders in their own right. And through this consultation process, they identified that this particular basket had this name. It has this particular use for either quail eggs or just general eggs, but primarily quail eggs. And they stated that they wanted this specific name, this specific spelling to be utilized. And whenever we're using this name in exhibits, that is the primary name that we should be using with basket in parentheses. So that's something that we've notated in the comments of the record and is something that we bring up whenever we are doing exhibit work or project work. The next slide, oops, sorry guys, is talks a little bit about how names are often reflective of the colonial powers who assigned them rather than the cultures and communities that they are concerning. And these changes include culture names, geographic locales, and more. And what you're seeing is an image of our database again that shows production culture. And what you can see is how our kind of predictive text fields work. But previously, before, we had everything listed, all the items listed as Terra Humara. And it was our understanding through conversations with community members and other research that we've done that the community does not prefer to be called that. They actually prefer to be call themselves Raramuri. I believe it means something along the lines of the people who run. And that Terra Humara was given to them by the Spanish colonial powers. And so in our database, we made a massive effort to change the production culture name to Raramuri. And then within our database, we have preferred and non-preferred terms within each associated concept, as it were, using the CMS lingo. And what we were able to do was set Terra Humara as non-preferred, so that if anyone should be cataloging or doing updates using older cataloging information, that if they type in Terra Humara, it automatically redirects them to select Raramuri. That's really important because, and it's been put into our workflows that if you see this, then you must select the one above. So that's incredibly important. And then also I wanted to state that it's still a work in progress. As you can see, we still have a lot of Terra Humara lines in there, and we're slowly working to kind of update those, but we're also keeping some of them for historic reference to show just how we've been changing our systems and practices within our database. Also, language within, excuse me, a language within CMSs should be really neutral, especially when dealing with descriptions of cultural resources. They should be neutral. They should be devoid of derogatory language wherever possible, unless, of course, I must stipulate that the derogatory language is a key core facet of that item. So if there's like a photographic caption that has something in there, you would want to keep that and then maybe have a conversation about the best ways to utilize that language in the future. It should also note that we should avoid using Euro-American language to describe non-Euro-American items. So for example, we had a wonderful intern doing a decent job cataloging, but they kept referring to gaming sticks as hockey sticks, even though the community does not, that in question did not play hockey. They were playing a very specific game. And so we had, that intern, through our internal checks and balances, change that after we recognized that we were having an issue with the continued use of the term hockey stick as a controlled object name rather than gaming stick. What you're also seeing right now is an example below in the image of how we are tracking our historical use of language, because we don't want to act like this language is just changing and that we have no history behind when we've made language changes. So I'm actually going to read this from the bottom up. And I'll also state that I have permission from the community to utilize this language that is part of an image of a specific individual community member, but that they did not want us to use his name specifically because his image and his name has been used a lot by other people without permission. So in keeping with our cultural care protocols and in prioritizing community needs, we've been able to utilize this as an example, but kind of block out the areas where there's a sensitivity that was identified by the community. And so the original image is a black and white image, and it shows this individual in profile from his mid-chest to the top of a feathered headdress. And it says that he's wearing a rather complicated feather headdress and a netted bandolier. And then it says his expression is stern with great dignity and reserve. This is highly problematic for a lot of reasons because it further feeds into that narrative of the stoic Indian, which we don't want to perpetrate, because we should not be commenting on the emotional or mental state of a person who is being featured within an image or a cultural resource unless they have given permission for us to do so. This individual did not, so we should not be doing that. Also, you'll note that above that, we have some very specific language that we use when we're wanting to keep colonial examples of poor language choice. And so we've kind of kept that as a note. And then above is what is the actual descriptor for this cultural resource that states that he's staring directly at the viewer with his face and body in high relief from the outdoor lighting. It also identifies that he's not wearing a bandolier, that it is in fact an eagle dance skirt that is a ceremonial dance skirt. So that's something that we needed to correct within the record as well. So I also think that language in general used to describe cultural resources, i.e. storage spaces, galleries, wings, donors, and how we need to change this language in order to recenter the community within the day-to-day narrative. This is so that we are reflective of the community's values of being connected to their cultural resources as living beings, not as stagnant items on shelves. So in thinking about storage spaces at the museum, we no longer call them labs. We used to say lab 2, lab 3, lab 6, as that was terminology that was rooted in our 20th century physical and cultural anthropology work, which centered on the classification of cultures and other hard sciences that were kind of more focused on racism. And also, many of our early anthropologists, as I said, were known to hold racist and misogynistic ideals. So it's something that we really wanted to discontinue, but we continue to keep track of that information because we need to make sure that we're talking about it because, as again, language and words have power, and it's an important step in productive and lasting change to make sure we're keeping track of that. I'll also note that in this section, there's a couple of bolded areas. There's the conversations around storage rooms or housing facilities. This is something that is actively changing right now in my conversations with the Indigenous Collections Care Working Group in particular. We've been having conversations around storage rooms or housing facilities because storage rooms still feels stagnant, still feels like a place of holding rather than housing, where housing is more lively. It's, filled with life, whereas storage is more about it being kind of put in stasis. And so that's a conversation that we're having about how do we talk about these storage areas, these rooms, these facilities, what does that mean? So that's one example of the current evolutionary process of language. And then the next one is that differentiation between below and above ground versus archaeology and ethnography. It's still a wide open field of how it's being utilized, but I'm beginning to hear more and more this switch to below and above ground to be a little bit more respectful and reflective of the fact that archaeology and ethnography have harmed Indigenous communities and communities of color. So we need to kind of recognize that. So the next slide I have here particularly applies to the singling out of donors or the collecting story when referring to cultural resources rather than by the community of origin, the maker, or even details about why an item is so important. When we focus on the donors or the collecting story, it's a form of erasure. So we need to make sure that we are not erasing the community's narrative out of the display and use of cultural resources, and shifting how we credit and refer to these cultural resources is really important. We still acknowledge this history, but we often prefer to defer to the Indigenous community primarily as we want to place ownership and authorship with the community of origin rather than with the individual who acquired. This also comes up in our exhibit panels and labels where we do not list the donor and we rather focus on the maker or community of origin. So this image on the left is of an old exhibit label that we've used for decades. And it gives some basic information, and it's not bad by any stretch. And it does have a lot of information, but it clearly privileges the donor's name rather than referencing the traditional name of the item. And then it also doesn't state the status of that we don't know who the name of the maker is. And it also sort of makes it seems like the life of this item started from the time at which it was collected, rather than having a larger and richer history within the Inupiat culture. And the image you see on the right, the bird and basket and net, this is an example of a label from our Kumeyaay Native Californians Ipai Tipai refreshed exhibit from 2019. These labels were created in consultation with the community, and they actually designated that they preferred a more streamlined label that focused on the maker, the band's affiliation, and the geographic locale when known, or to simply state when that information was not known. And they did not want us to focus on the donors of these cultural resources. They wanted to focus on the people who created them. And so that's a change that we've been making both within this exhibit, and is a change we're working to enact within other exhibits as well. So that was a lot of information, and I am coming to an end, I promise. So I wanted to have a brief discussion about the future of language. And so at a basic level, language can be used to build or reinforce or change how people interact with cultural resources. Descriptive language in particular should be about affirming traditional knowledge of the Indigenous communities. And it is only through the respectful and authorized incorporation of Indigenous ontologies, their epistemologies, and their taxonomies, say that 3 times fast, with what is known about an item, that we can interact with these items and their communities in a meaningful way. So what I see for the future of descriptive language, that conversation is to go further than before, what has, to become a true embodiment of Indigenous values, where we can balance Western ideals of categorization with the prioritization of Indigenous traditional knowledge, by seeding our preconceived notions of authority over stewardship. And this practice takes time, and it's a muscle, and it's a muscle that we have to exercise in order to see the best results. And we know what's best for us. We just have to do it, basically. And I already see this happening with so many wonderful museum professionals like yourselves, who are taking such an interest in understanding what more you all can do to reflect the communities represented within your institutions. And further, the future of descriptive language is limitless. We can and we must think outside of the box, to not only understand our history of colonial oppression as a field, but to also imagine a future where written language may just be one method of sharing information about cultural resources. I mean, we already talk with our families and friends via emojis, emoticons, GIFs or GIFs, however you say it, and other visual language to talk. And arguably, using images is the oldest form of documented human communication. So why not think about how our past and our present image-based communications might translate into future practice? So that's just a nugget of thought, but it's a bit exciting to my mind. So in my last couple of slides, I have some additional resources for you all to take a look at. There's many more out there in the world, and you are more than welcome to email me at any point should you have any comments or questions. I love hearing from you all. So thank you for giving me your time, and I'm going to pass it back over to Sarah, because I'm pretty sure I went well over my 30 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Kara, people want to hear more from you than they do me. So there's not a problem at all with taking as much time as you did. I want to remind everyone that Kara is being very gracious with her knowledge and her time to answer some questions for us. So please consider the chat box open. If you haven't taken advantage of it up until this point in the presentation, please go right ahead and answer or place into the chat any questions you have. To get us started, though, Kara, if you're open for it, I'll ask you a question first. And I do have a few of those. As a facilitator, and for the purposes of everyone that's here, sometimes when we are speaking as professionals, and I appreciate the great care you took to say, this wasn't something that happened overnight. This is a process. This hasn't necessarily been easy, right, or consistent across the scope of the work, which sometimes when we get to do the presentation or see the slides, it doesn't come across that way, right? So I want to really pinpoint in on that and ask, One of the questions, I think there's something coming up in the chat as well too. Okay, about donor acknowledgement. Erica, that's where my question was coming from as well. And mine's a little different, but what I'm curious about is you spoke about a guiding principle of truth telling and accountability, right, within the process. And so as donor labels and that public piece, right, is shifting for the institution, right, in privileging an Indigenous labeling process and practice, how does the institution take accountability for how those objects came to the institution?
That's a very good question. So it's in part about being transparent. That is how we take accountability, in particular when we're having conversations with the affected Indigenous community. So it is about sharing what we know and how we know these items came to us. It's very much reflective of the NAGPRA consultation process, but for us, NAGPRA doesn't require you to share everything and be completely transparent. You just share what you got, and then you have a conversation. But really, the spirit of that is full collaboration. And so for us, it's sharing what we know and how we know things took place, as that sort of kind of getting to the point of it. So, for example, we've been working with scholars of Mayan descent who are working within the diaspora on a larger community-based refresh of our Maya Heart of the Sky, Heart of the Earth exhibition. And so when prepping for that, there was a whole series of cultural resources that have a variety of different backgrounds associated with them. And so we did kind of a deep dive of research into each item that is being brought up for consultation with the community. So it wasn't just, here's the acquisition paperwork, here's the donor information, next. It was, when was this person active? What was going on in the region and in the time frame, and doing a little bit of that deeper dive to sort of prep the conversation. And so it didn't state that, one of the individuals who had donated this item, it didn't state why he was in the region. But then I did a little more research and found out, oh, he was actually part of a chicle, gum harvesting project that had massive implications for deforestation, and kind of devastation of a region. And so making sure that we are sharing that information as we find it, and then bringing that to the community so that they can then input in, correct us if we're wrong, have a further conversation. And the reason I brought that up is because that was one of the items that really hit up, really kind of brought to the forefront conversations around colonial activity within the Mayan traditional territory. And so by doing those like smaller deep dives into what we hold, and then presenting that information as we know it, has been incredibly transformative, because we could have just said, hey, these are these items, this is what we have, what do you want us to do? We took that next step of, this is what we think happened, is this correct? How do we move forward?
Awesome. And Kara, to put emphasis on Erica's question specifically, asking to you, have donors been accepting of not being recognized, right? Is that a conversation you've been a part of? How has that gone with the rest of your team?
So far, it's been pretty quiet. Most of what we hold, the donors are long gone. Their children don't really care, or not engaged in the process. I will say though that we have had some former board members and folks like that who maybe have not been as welcoming of the decolonial process that we're undertaking. And it's something that we have to work through, and it's delicate. It's not just saying, oh, no donors, we're not dealing with you, but it's having a conversation with the donors as well, as to understand that, and maybe engaging with them. And this might be a little bit outside of my scope of work. That's more on the development side of things, working with donors, but having these conversations with them about why they may not be prioritized within the object label for the item. And it might be that they end up being in a listing somewhere else that's not pride of place within the exhibit. It might be in a different spot. So this is something that we're evolving, we're working towards, and I'm sure we will have some growing pains as we work into this process, for sure. So we'll share more about that.
There's a question from Marguerite in the chat as well. Have you come up against using non-Roman characters in the descriptions that you're using? And if so, are there any thoughts on including transcriptions of languages rather than transliterations, i.e. using Roman characters to represent those pronunciations?
That's a really good question, and it's something that we have to work through and with. Luckily, within our database, it's pretty accepting of these transcriptions using non-Roman characters, but you still get the weird, wingdings whenever occasionally when you try something. So typically how we come across that is if we're not able to use it for whatever reason, if it's just not translating because the base code just can't do it. What we usually end up doing is we try to either create an image that goes with the catalog record that is, an image of whatever's happening, and then maybe have a descriptor in the comments that speaks to that image, see attached image, how to pronounce it in Roman characters and moving forward that way. It's not a fantastic solution, but it's something that we have to work around. And we sometimes just don't know if it's going to work or not. But there are some fantastic, alt control code symbols that are out there and getting more and more popular with use. And so it's my registrary CMS databasey hope that maybe we can start to build in some of this language as I want to check, Inupiat language, bam, and it goes. That is a way in the future thought, but that's something that I would hope to see. And there's a lot of, databases out there, especially ones that are made for and by Indigenous communities that are starting to take off. I don't want to talk about them specifically because I don't want to do vendor stuff, but there are some out there that privilege that kind of language use.
Awesome. And just as a quick follow-up with that, Kara, even when you were speaking, you said, my ability to speak this language, right, is limited in terms of pronunciation. And we all are aware of, native tongue that is diminishing, right, as speakers have died off, and about native language revitalization movements, right, that are being upheld by both native elders and youth around the country. Are you recording audio names for objects, right? Is there a spoken or a pronunciation piece in any of the description that's happening?
That's a fantastic question. And as of right now, we have not, but it is something that I'm actively working to address we have a grant with IMLS. It's our second grant with the Kumeyaay community, or the Kumeyaay Nation in particular, that is about, I told you how we kind of refreshed our really outdated and archaic exhibit about the community. It's very anthropological in nature still. It's better, but still not great. And so there's this grant is actually focused on creating the content for a new exhibit, whatever that form that takes place is, and it's a fully community collaborative event. And so at one of our kickoff meetings that we'll be having, I'd say in a couple weeks actually, is we're going to be having these conversations of how do you want your language to be represented? And so this is actually one of the discussion points that I want to have is how do you want audio, visual, how do you want to be represented? And then to start incorporating that in. We do have some audio recordings that have been digitized, but they are of sensitive ceremonies, death ceremonies. And so we can't really use those in that way, but it's something that we do have some access and control over at this point. So more coming in the future.
Great. There's a question from Stephanie in the chat about how do you and your museum colleagues document the consultations that are happening with communities now?
Oh, fantastic. So we're trying really hard to start centralizing this into the database that we use. Please contact me offline and I can share with you what I'm doing. I've seen a couple of questions about what do you use? So we're working to kind of centralize that into the database that we use. But for right now, basically with each consultation that we have with a specific community, we have alphanumeric files that we use, and then we have a larger spreadsheet that kind of documents the conversation. There's also surveys and questionnaires that kind of we're developing that go out with the community that come back that allow us to get qualitative and quantitative data. And then the documentation process is really, if recording is allowed or wanted, we will record that, and then we do those transcriptions. And then usually we end up deleting that recording at community request. We try not to hang on to them for too long, just because our space requirements are not limitless, unfortunately. But we definitely try to make sure we have, PDF-A quality documentations of conversations that are taking place. And then we have a really aggressive feedback loop through email conversations of after the meeting, we give them the notes. Is this correct? And then they come back and we come back with touch points. So it's a give and take, but usually we're transcribing, or not transcribing, we are having conversations, tracking through our database or tracking through just a basic Word document right now. And we're hoping to pull all of that into the database so that we can, be a little bit more responsive. Great.
Thanks, Kara. One of the things since we're on database, talking about that now, a question for you again about people who are making this shift, right? And are here in part because they're looking to negotiate and discuss these with maybe some colleagues or supervisors who may not be as open to the process as they might be, right? As we look at making change in these spaces. So I'm curious about the choice by which to retain some of the descriptions, right? Clearly labeled as problematic, right? And previous within it, and how that choice was made by the institution, right, as well as in consultation. Were there folks who said we shouldn't keep any of that in terms of its long-lasting damage? Were there folks who were advocating for keeping it because of the historical record or as a learning or educational space? How did those conversations happen?
Sure. I think we've been incredibly lucky as an institution because we have such buy-in from the highest level all the way down. So, I understand that is not the case for many institutions, and that most folks who are seeking to engage in this work really have to do it at the level that they can enact change. And that might be very small levels. It might be, changing, a preferred culture name. It might be changing how you write your descriptions and kind of keeping track of it that way. But for us, truth telling and accountability, that's that guiding principle. That's that core aspect. And so when we restarted the inventory process in particular, we would come up against records like the hockey stick or the individual who was stern and stoic. These were like clear indicators. We were like, whoa. They kind of pop up off the screen and you're like, yeah, that has to change, but we need to make sure we are keeping track of that change. And so that's, a thing where we hadn't planned for it, but as we were inventorying, we realized, oh, these are prime examples of how we can make change and how we can track that change moving forward. And so for us, it was really seeing, oh, these are the spaces that we can enact change, and this is how we track it, and this is how we talk about it moving forward. And then putting that into our trainings as well. So that's some of that practice is when we're having trainings for interns or fellowships, they get a full training manual that talks about language, how and why we use it, what is good, what is bad, what is inappropriate, and then moving forward from there, and then building in a more robust tracking system as we move forward through the inventory process. And so it's not for us, it's about, it was not great language, but it needs to be kept. Otherwise, we could pretend in 15, 20 years, oh, we've always done it great. That was a perfect record. No. So I think for us, everyone has agreed that you need to track these changes, and just how you do it depends on how the information is within your systems.
Great. And Stephanie, I am going to beg, borrow, and steal to ask one more question. Can I do it? All right. Normally when Stephanie shows up, that's a sign and everyone groans in their own rooms that we have to stop. But I'm going to ask one more for you, only because Maria asked it very early in the conversation. I want to make sure it gets surfaced here, which was saying that, does the museum hold documents or documentation? I'm assuming this is a by, Maria, correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, Europeans about and around Indigenous peoples. And if so, how do you decolonize the language around those?
So like research done by, your Americans on Indigenous community. Oh yeah. Oh yes, we definitely for sure do. We are very typical in that way. We were quite heavily a research institution for the longest time. So we have scads and scads of documentation and information that was either written about what we hold or it was part of a larger library. So we have a lot of this information. And so for us, and let me just kind of backtrack, make sure I'm answering the question, what do we do with all of this? Essentially was the question, was, well, we keep it. We have to keep it because it's part of our history, but also we have to recognize that there are levels of access that need to be put in place when dealing with this information, because it is sensitive in some areas. Some of it can be derogatory. It may not have sensitive information, cultural sensitive information, but it may be just highly derogatory to the community. So there's certain levels of access that we kind of been working to put in place, specifically with access by our staff to these records, and then access by the outside public, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to these records and to this information. And what does that mean? And so we have a general moratorium on access. If you want to do research, you need to get permission from the Indigenous community. And then we will help you with that process and we will share all that we have. But if you don't have permission, if you didn't get permission, you don't get access. And it's the same for our own internal uses. Like I can't just use that image of that database record without consent. I have to make sure that what we're doing is okay. And so that's reaching out to our community, having that conversation moving forward. So we keep it. Sometimes we don't know what to do with it because there's too much, but that's part of the process and part of understanding where we need to grow and how we need to do better moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Kara. Stephanie, I'm going to let you come on mic to wrap us up for the day and talk about next steps. Thank you so much, Kara. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks so much, Kara, for sharing your significant work with us. What a wonderful time to spend an hour on a Monday. This concludes our time together in the webinar today. But I do hope that all participants are going to log in again tomorrow so that we can discuss the content that was introduced to us today. Note that tomorrow's Zoom link is different from the one that you used today. And the Zoom link for tomorrow is in your confirmation email that you should have received. And so I look forward to gathering again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the Zoom room. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon on this last day of February. We will see you tomorrow in March. Take care.